you have to think about the hiring managers that you're working with almost like customers, I think. And at the end of the day, you have to keep your main focus on just bringing in great people. If that's working, the other pieces will flow in a more natural way.
So what does it really take for your business to attract world-class talent today? I'm Dave Travers, president of ZipRecruiter. And on Talent All-Stars, we shine a light on the people and the day-to-day processes behind recruitment and retention at some of the world's most influential businesses. Today's Talent All-Star is Katie Czerepak, a longtime friend of mine who happens to be head of talent and operating partner for Bain Capital's Tech Opportunities team. It's a role that gives her exposure to a wide range of fast-growing companies in Bain's portfolio. And as you'll hear today, Katie's reached a point where most of her work is so aligned with her interests that most of the time it really doesn't feel like work. But it wasn't always that way. And in this episode, you'll learn how Katie developed the confidence to take big leaps forward in her career, why she finds it useful to think about hiring managers as her customer, and why at fast-growing companies, it's often better to hire highly adaptable generalists. So without further ado, let's jump into my conversation with Katie Czerepak. So because not everybody has the opportunity to have known you as well as I do over the years, can you start off by just give us the background? How did you get to Bain Capital and running talent for the fund?
Yeah. So I've been at Bain Capital for about 2.5 years, and my role here is focused on all things talent for our portfolio companies. We're all tech growth companies, so love that space. Prior to this, I was the chief people officer at an agriculture tech startup called Indigo here in Boston. I joined there when we had maybe 45 employees and stayed for 5 years. We had over 1,200 employees when I left. So it was crazy scale while I was there. And a lot of what our companies are going through now are a similar journey to that. So I like to think I've kind of lived that, but obviously every company is a bit different. And I went to Indigo out of McKinsey, and I was at McKinsey for 9 years, all focused on talent there. So that's where I would say I really kind of grew my talent chops. McKinsey is, their assets are their people. That's what they focus on in terms of what they are selling. It's their product. And so they put a lot of effort and energy into people development. So learned a ton there that really was foundational to a lot of the work I've done.
So tell me a little bit about when was the moment you thought, wow, talent for so many people in business is something that they're doing when they need to hire someone. But when was the moment when you figured out like this could be something that is like the focus?
Yeah, it's such a good question because I feel like it isn't something that most people know. I wasn't sitting around as a 10-year-old, like I wanted to be an actress. I did not want to be in HR. So, and actually I resisted the fact that I was in HR for many years. Now I kind of embrace it, but it wasn't necessarily what I was dreaming about as a kid, although so many of the themes are consistent. I've always been a people person. You and I know each other from college, and I always was fascinated by people, loved people, just thought it was people really interesting, but I never really thought I could make a job out of that. So it took me a little while. I went into consulting out of Stanford and then went to business school, and I went back into consulting and was kind of still trying to figure it all out and I really purposefully started to say, what is it that I love? And I talked to a lot of people that I trusted their opinions and just kept coming back to this theme around people and talent and tried to figure out what is that actual job. But I'm so grateful that I did, because once I figured that out, it's trite. Everybody says it's like when you like what you do, it doesn't feel like a job. But I feel like I get to feel that way frequently now. That is certainly not always been the case. Like there's plenty of times throughout my career where it feels like work. And it doesn't mean you're not putting in the time or the hours, but I spend a lot of time talking with our CEOs and our chief people officers at our companies. And that never feels like work to me. It always feels like I'm catching up with people I really enjoy and get to hear how they're doing. And even when we're talking about work, because those conversations are focused on business issues and challenges and all the people stuff related to that. But it's so interesting the way you think about all the people dynamics. And particularly, I think when you're solving a people problem and thinking about what's underlying the motives for people and how that all fits together, that just feels like you're at dinner with a friend.
I love that. So few people, I think, in their career get to feel that way, and I'm lucky enough to feel that way too. But as you think about, having earned the right now, where you're feeling that level of comfort talking to chief people officers, CEOs, at portfolio companies, at potential companies, like rewind back to the moment in your career where you were getting comfortable, getting to be in that room or in that position where maybe it didn't feel like catching up with a friend yet, because that's a big deal, to be in that room and talking about those sorts of issues. Like, when did that start to happen, and how did it feel like early on, and what's changed for you? How have you gotten better at it?
I have this vivid memory of being 22 and in my first job and being the lowest person on the totem pole in a room taking notes and feeling like I literally had not one thing to say. I had no idea what to add to the conversation. And so I remember that very clearly. And I think over the course of the years, you increase your exposure to different things. And I think you have to put yourself in situations that scare you, that feel overwhelming, where you're talking to someone that you're really nervous about. And that's the way you build the muscle. I remember when I was early on at Indigo, I had to call a very senior CHRO for a reference call. We were hiring a CFO, and he had been a big deal at a big Fortune 100 company, and gave the CHRO as a reference. And my boss at the time was like, "Oh, can you just call the CHRO because you're the head of people?" And I remember thinking, that is a really senior person. I was super nervous for the call. And now that wouldn't faze me nearly as much as it did. And that was only, 7 years ago or something like that. So I think along the way, you just have these moments where you're freaked out and you're nervous and you don't know what to say, but you get through it. And then it gives you more confidence for the next one. Okay.
So being at the role you play, where you're in between board member, investor, CEOs, chief people officers, how do you, with all that pattern recognition you've built up, how do you, when you have your first few interactions with a company, what do you look for that causes you to then say, turn to your fellow partners at Bain Capital and say, holy cow, this company has an amazing people and talent?
We think about this a lot. So I'm involved with every diligence process that we do as Bain, like for our portfolio. So I go to an investment committee meetings. I meet with the CEOs beforehand and try to get a perspective on how they view their organization. And the things that stand out to me a lot when I lean in on a CEO is when I hear them talk about values and culture, when that's something that I don't need to ask too much about, but it comes up early in the conversation and then provides a framework for how they think about the people function. I also love to hear them talk favorably about their chief people officer. The respect for what the people function does and the value that can bring to accelerating growth in an organization. When a CEO talks about that, it makes me say, this is someone that we want to lean in on.
And what is it when you hear that CEO speaking highly of the head of talent or the chief people officer? What is the sort of positive talk that really differentiates or sets somebody apart?
It's about being a thought partner. I rely on my chief people officer for their input. I respect their opinion. I go to them for questions. It's all about that partnership. I think at the end of the day, there are many flavors of what makes a great chief people officer. Not everybody comes from the same background, but that ability to be the thought partner to the CEO is where the magic happens.
So now I talk to, and I know you talk to lots of people in the people business and in talent. One of the things we hear about a lot is the struggle to get resources and make the case to do the things that are necessary to drive the business forward and attract the people that are necessary. You, having had a ton of experience coaching portfolio companies and CEOs and CPOs, like, give us your insight in, like, how does that work? How do you effectively advocate for that?
So I think it's important to understand what that means to CEOs and how that shows up. And I think much of it comes from just bringing in great people. And there's many things that you can focus on as a CHRO or as a recruiter or someone leading talent acquisition. But at the end of the day, you have to keep your main focus on bringing in great people, and you have to think about the hiring managers that you're working with almost like customers, I think, just and make sure they are satisfied with the work that you're doing, because that relationship that you have with hiring managers, whether that hiring manager is a first-time hiring manager on your tech team or whether that hiring manager is the CEO, their opinion about how well talent acquisition is working is going to be driven by their relationship with you and how hard they think you're working, what kind of talent you're bringing in. And so those relationships, I think you have to focus on kind of more than you're worried about any of the other pieces. And if that's working, the other pieces will flow into that in a more natural way.
I love what you said there about thinking about the hiring manager as a customer, because I think it is so easy in the talent and people business when you put all this work into implementing all these systems and you have all these rules you have to comply with and scrutiny about making sure you're doing things the right way. It is very easy when you're talking to an internal customer, a hiring manager, to be focused on those guardrails and systems and processes and not zoom out and hear the customer. Can you talk a little bit about how you have been successful, or how some of the chief people officers and CEOs that you've worked with have had talent teams be successful at that customer orientation?
So a couple different things to think about. One is the chief people officer, which is the role I played more. I didn't grow up through recruiting, so I never actually was a recruiter. But as a chief people officer, I hired a lot of recruiters. And the first recruiter that I hired when I was at Indigo is, to this day, probably the best recruiter that I know. And she was young. She did not have a lot of years of experience, but she was the best person to work with. Like, everybody loved working with her. She came into the room. She was so positive. She always had a smile on her face, always had a can-do attitude. I remember going to her at one point and saying, we need to hire 30 sales reps in 3 weeks. And every recruiter who's listening to this is like, yeah, NFW, like that's not happening. And she was like, okay, let's get going. And I think that attitude of, it wasn't that she thought it was easy to do, but that attitude of, I'm here to support the business and I'm here to show up and I'm here to work with you to figure out how to get things done, is really important. And just having that positive energy makes you someone that your hiring managers want to be around. It makes you someone who brings a certain energy to everything, and that is attractive to candidates too. So I think there just really is a positive energy vibe that becomes really important throughout all of the recruiting processes. It's not the only thing.
I completely agree that it's not the only thing, but I want to double click on that because I love that. The saying what you're describing, saying yes before you say no, like before, say yes, and then let's figure out the problems together when they come up, rather than, and I struggle with this myself, with thinking about boards and investors and CEO and everything. Like, you can immediately, when someone makes an unreasonable ask or a big ask, think about, well, I already know the 5 problems that are going to come up. But as a recruiter or as a business leader of any sort, saying yes and say, I totally get the objective, and let's figure out how to do this. Well, let's get started, and then take the problems as they come, totally changes the conversation and the perception. I love that.
And by the way, I think that this is a trap that smart people fall into, because smart people quickly see the flaws in the way someone is thinking about things. And the temptation is to then go and intellectually work on all the reasons why something can't work. And that can be interesting to do. But I think it is a problem that you see all across businesses. It's not just limited to the HR function, where you can't be a no person. That just doesn't work well.
Okay, so the customer orientation, back to the other thing we were talking about, the other powerful thing about that is when you learn the language of your customer, your hiring manager internally, what that allows you to do is then, when you're going to ask for resources, when you need the next, set of people or next system or whatever it is to take your talent strategy forward, a lot of time putting it in the language of your customer about what it's like for a hiring manager and how they're struggling, rather than the perspective of how the talent team is struggling. Sometimes that just framing the problem differently is a huge part of that. Is that something you've experienced before? How have you approached that?
Yeah, I think if you're presenting it as this is a problem with recruiting, then it's easy for someone who's making a decision to feel like that's a recruiter problem, they should figure it out. Whereas it needs to be presented more like a business problem that we all need to figure out. And I cannot underestimate the importance of the functional lead or the department head in some of this. And for a couple of reasons. One is that person can be your advocate if there's something that needs to happen that is affecting their ability to hire people. It's very stressful for a leader of a business unit to feel like they can't hire the people that they need to hire. And so this is ultimately their problem too, but you need to be in it together. And then the other reason this is important is that CEOs really do listen to their direct reports. And so the complaints I will hear sometimes about recruiting are not from CEOs, but CEOs who've heard someone from their direct reports complaining about recruiting. So sales doesn't think they can hire anyone, or the engineering leader thinks their recruiters don't know enough about tech to be able to hire these people. It's not the CEO's perception. They don't have enough exposure, but they listen when their direct reports complain. So I think it's all about bringing the problems, as you say, to make them about everybody's business problem versus a specific problem for the function.
Fantastic. Zooming out to the business of being in talent, can you think about a particular hire you've made, or whether it was an internal promotion or shifting somebody or finding somebody who was a diamond in the rough or whatever it was for you? Give us an example of when talent really worked and you got to be part of a decision that really paid off and what that felt like.
I'm a big believer in bringing in smart people who may not be perfectly qualified for the exact element of the role, but who you trust can figure it out. And this is not true in every situation. There are some roles that need very specific sets of expertise and talent, but in many startups, you will benefit a ton from having high horsepower, smart people who can go and be jack of all trades. And so one of the things that we did both while I was at Indigo and that we really emphasize with our portfolio companies now is hiring chief of staff or business transformation partner or strategy analyst. There's different titles and there's different levels for what the role can be, but these are people who you can bring in when the organization just needs lots of stuff. We did this in spades at Indigo, and oftentimes they have done something like consulting or banking, or they have this kind of generalist experience, and you put them in on strategy, corporate development, finance, and FP&A, and they just have the chops to really get their fingers into a lot of things. And it's then are often promoted into roles that are running business units or doing something along those lines. And so for anyone at a growth company where roles are fluctuating, where there's going to be lots of opportunity, that is the kind of role that I love to see. And we've done that across a bunch of our portfolio companies, have some outstanding people there who have exceeded my expectations in terms of what they've been able to bring to the table.
Great. We're going to do some rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
Ooh, love it.
Yes. Okay. So if you're caught in an elevator with the CEO as the chief people officer, and the CEO turns to you and says, "What's the measure of success for the people team?" What's your answer?
I think the best measure of how successful a people team is how everybody else in the company talks about them. And if it's like, oh, here comes HR, I need to avoid them, then that's probably not a strategic people team. If it's, I love my people business partner, then the whole function is humming well.
Okay. What do you think is your best interview tip or question? Like what makes you a good interviewer? Give us a tidbit.
The question that I love is, if I were to talk to your boss, what would they say about you? And what would they say you were really good at? And what would they say you were working on at the time? It's so helpful for people to step out and think about how another person would phrase something, because it takes them out of giving that sort of canned, practiced answer and gives you a perspective on what they think their boss would say. And that is usually pretty interesting in terms of assessing how they're going to perform.
Okay, one more, which is, how is attracting talent to a company going to be different 5 years from now than it is today?
This is kind of a boring AI answer, but I'm really interested to see how that shifts where people focus. And I think it will help take the efficiencies into the recruiting, like help cut down on inefficiency in the recruiting process. So I actually don't think it will take away from the importance of that human interaction. So I think we will still see that real emphasis on person to person. And if anything, I think people are getting a little bit over fatigued by too much digital interaction. And so I think we'll still continue to see that, but I think it will become more efficient. And I think we will learn to do things faster, and we'll have a lot more technology to help us get there.
Katie, this was incredible. Thank you for your time today. This was awesome.
This was awesome, Dave. It was so fun catching up with you and talking to you.
That's Katie Czerepak, operating partner and head of talent for Bain Capital's Tech Opportunities team. You can find her on LinkedIn. We'll put a link to her profile in the description below. Thanks for watching the show this week. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more episodes like this, and leave us a comment mentioning your favorite takeaway from Katie. And remember, we're an audio podcast too. We're in all the podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Just search Talent All-Stars and hit follow. I'm Dave Travers. We'll see you right back here with another Talent All-Star next time.